Hello, my name is Dr. Stephanie Kaywood, Director of the Centre for Gender and Africa Studies. Since the establishment of the Programme for Gender Studies at the University of the Free State in 2001, Women's Day on 9 August has been commemorated by an event or lecture to mark this important milestone in South African history, but specifically in terms of gender activism. Notable presenters include world-renowned activist, visual artist Zanele Moholi, who spoke on the theme Exploring Born Frees through Visual Activism. Subsequently, the Biennial Gendered Worlds Lecture was introduced to provide a platform for engaging on gender topics to take place every second year. To date, we have hosted 3 lectures by Professor Lillian Lem Atanga, who lectured on gender discourse and cognition and the implications for political participation. Professor Jack Halberstam, who delivered a lecture titled Exit Routes After Feminism, After Gender, and Professor Gabrielle Griffin, who reflected on the difficulty of achieving change. For the 2023 lecture, the Centre for Gender and Africa Studies collaborated with the UFS Art Gallery, currently showing the exhibition Eureka by artist Professor Janine Allen and Dr. André Rose. The lecture by Professor Pamila Gupta, Research Professor in the Centre for Gender and Africa Studies, is titled Landscaping South Africa's Gendered Hinterlands. Pamila Gupta was appointed Research Professor at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa, affiliated with the Centre for Gender and Africa Studies from 1 January 2023. She was formerly full professor-based advisor at the University of the Witwatersrand. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her research and writing interests include Portuguese colonial and Jesuit missionary history in India, diasporas, islands, tourism, heritage and design in the Indian Ocean, photography, tailoring and visual cultures in East Africa, and architecture, infrastructure and affect in South Africa. She is the co-editor of Eyes Across the Water, Navigating the Indian Ocean with Isabel Hofmeyr and Michael Pearson, and author of 3 monographs, The Relic State, St. Francis Xavier and the Politics of Ritual in Portuguese India, Portuguese Decolonization in the Indian Ocean World, History and Ethnography, and Heritage and Design, 10 Portraits from Goa. She has a forthcoming edited volume with Sarah Nuttall, Esther Perrine, and Hanneke Stewart entitled Planetary Hinterlands, Abandonment, Extraction, and Care that will be published with Palgrave's series on globalization, culture, and society. She is currently working on a new book manuscript entitled Experiments in the Dark, Visualizing Capital Art Studio, Zanzibar.
Hello, my name is Pamila Gupta, and I'm a research professor based here at the University of the Free State at the Center for Gender and Africa Studies. And it's my honor to be presenting the Gendered Worlds Lecture entitled Landscaping South Africa's Gendered Hinterlands. Okay, so just a little bit of background. What I'm going to be doing is speaking for about 40 minutes and giving a context for this new project on hinterlands, global planetary hinterlands, in fact. And then I'm going to speak a little bit to my own piece in this larger project. So to begin with, this is a book called Planetary Hinterlands, Extraction, Abandonment, Care, and it's an edited book that I've been working on for the last 3 years with 3 other co-editors, Esther Perrine, Hanneke Stewart, and Sarah Nuttall. And it's been a wonderful, productive project that started over COVID with an online conference and then developed into a wonderful edited volume, of which we're doing the proofs right now, and it's coming out with Palgrave. So I'm very excited to be presenting parts of that work here today. Okay, so just to contextualize what we mean by hinterland, and what I'm offering here on the PowerPoint are 3 different definitions, sort of historic definitions of what the hinterland has been conceptualized as. And I'm not going to read through them, but you can see them here. The idea of the hinterland from the 19th century Handbook of Commercial Geography, and then from the German hinterland as well, and thinking of it as a land behind or the back of. And then from the OED, that lies directly in the back country to that area lying behind a port and to the fringe areas of a town or city. So I want to just sort of give that point as a context for what we're thinking about. Okay, so here then we're introducing a new conceptualization of the hinterland, which doesn't let go of that historical context either. And our argument is that we need one that allows for both the rural and urban realms to intermix, and the processes of urbanization and ruralization as they unfold and are untangled in uneven ways as both emerging and emergent, and in a process of interaction, as we call it, from Barad. And what the book then is offering is a multi-sided and multifaceted engagement, conceptual architecture of the present, thinking through hinterlands. And here it's really important to, the idea behind this book was to think about the global north and the global south in conversation and not just to focus on one rather than the other. And so the chapters in the book very much reflect that entanglement across the north and south. And it's a word that my colleague Sarah Nuttall has written in depth about, and we really sort of frame the hinterlands through that concept of entanglement. Okay, and we want to think about social spaces, cultural imaginations, and more than human, thinking about the animal, the human, and the plant in relation. Okay, and again, a backdrop for thinking through hinterlands, what we call the 3 C's: colonialism, capitalism, and climate, and thinking about the ways in which those are the backdrops for thinking about hinterlands in the here and the now. And to add to the 3 C's are the 3 L's. We want to think and look from the hinterland to its landscapes, life forms, and livelihoods, and to read for the affectivities of the hinterland. And again, this is from our introduction, which hopefully the book will be published in September. I'm very much looking forward to that. And this idea of hinterland thinking. Again, as a lens to think through the times and spaces and shapes and experiences across the categories of the urban, the rural, but also wilderness or nature, and to foreground the human and more than human lively processes. And again, to think in relation to capitalism, colonialism, and ruination, and climate. Okay. And another aspect of the book project is to think about the relationship between hinterlands and homelands, and always to suggest that there's a complex relationship between them. And I think everyone here could think about what their own homeland is in relation to what a hinterland is. And again, in relation to contemporary hinterlands, it is important to carefully parse their specific characteristics, functions, and potentialities, and to recognize what links both historical and contemporary hinterlands. So again, to not let go of the historical, but rather think about the contemporary informed by the historical. And again, this is where imperialism and extractivism come into the picture. So again, industries specifically like mining and intensive agriculture, but also logistical infrastructures, which are new to the hinterland, crucial to sustaining and speeding up global trade. And this includes spaces and productions like data farms, distribution centers, and waste processing plants, which we argue are particularly located in the hinterlands. So the idea is to look at those sites instead of just abandoning them or leaving them as exhausted or barren, but rather to look at what's happening to them. And then the next 3 slides are really briefly a book outline. To give you a sense, there's 3 parts, and the part 1 is on materialities, extractions, and logic. And as you can see, there's quite a few different case studies from different parts of the world. We can see China, the U.S., South Africa, Namibia, India, as well, and Mexico in this first set of chapters. Okay, and part 2, as you can see, my piece, which I'm going to talk about at the end of the overview of the larger book project. My piece based in South Africa. You can also see the U.S. coming up again, as well as South Africa again, and the U.K. and as the UK again. Okay, and then the part 2. Again, the thematics here are affectivities, abandonment, and dreaming. Okay, and this idea of dreaming is really going to come up again later in our conversation. And then part 3 is about ecologies and the idea of care and transformation. And again, you can see case studies from one, thinking about the hinterland at sea and not just on land, and thinking about what water does to thinking about the hinterlands. Again, a case study from the Netherlands, from the U.S., from South Africa, 2 from the Netherlands actually, and another one from South Africa. And then we end with a really lovely piece by Jennifer Wenzel and thinking about the underground as a form of hinterland. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move on to my chapter, which is Landscaping South Africa's Gendered Hinterlands. And I want to start with thinking through the ideas of Jeremy Foster, and you can see his book entitled Washwood Sun, which was published in 2008. Okay, and here I'm going to read from his quote. Traveling around South Africa when I was growing up, I noticed that certain districts displayed a distinct quality, and how in some instances this took on an animistic quality best described as a mood. And here this idea of mood is something I really sort of developed further. Seemingly inhering in the experiential and phenomenological qualities of the landscape, it resembled the character found in human individuals, infinitely nuanced and hard to describe it, yet always distinctive. As with people, so with these naively given sections of geography, some seemed to welcome one into the aura, while others made one feel profoundly uncomfortable. Okay, so I want you to just sit with that quote while I sort of introduce the two authors. Okay, and here I'm going to read bits from the chapter. Okay, I always miss the distinct light and lighting of South Africa when I'm away. It is what compels me to return. I have increasingly become interested in writing about South Africa's landscape, a place that I have called home for the last 17 years. In some ways, Jeremy Foster's work helped me think about what I have felt, lived, and experienced. It was fortuitous, perhaps, then that when I came across his work on the socio-nature of South Africa's landscape, as entwining natural beauty and political turmoil, I had lived long enough in South Africa to be able to grasp what he was trying to articulate. I liked the idea of grounding my theory from and in the South, following John and Jean Komaroff, while supplying his evocative term and climatic ode, Washed with Sun, the title of his 2008 book, to the idea of hinterlands and two specific hinterland formations relevant to South African history, to see what it opens up analytically. For me, the idea of Washed with Sun references exactly the tensions of politics and aesthetics inherent to the South African landscape, and perhaps all landscapes, including the role of affect, of atmospheres and elements, or rather the elemental, seasonal grammars of climate and nature, light and color in defining place. Equally important in conceptualizing hinterlands as landscapes is that of human, sensorial, plant, and animal relations, something that has been left out of Foster's analysis, but that I want to include here. Okay. So in the following sections, I use Foster's framing of Washed with Sun to revisit the white ostrich farm town and the black township that Nixon and Dalimi have powerfully written about in their memoirs that are thematically of self and place. I want to explore what happens when we refract these two locations through the prism of the hinterland and see them as washed with sun, in the hope that they will offer a potential way of thinking with and writing about hinterlands in relation to South Africa's changing geographies of rural and urban. This is also a political and also always a political project, one of refining our sensibilities and rhythms of place and time, past and present and future, and giving equal agency to human and non-human, including land, plant, animal, actors, and relations. Okay, so I'm going to begin with Rob Nixon. I'm going to go to the next slide, of Prickly Pears and Aloes, Feathers and Fantasies. And I've put two of the quotes from his book that I'm sort of working through and discussing in the next section. Okay. In my reading of Nixon's South African memoir, Dreambirds, The Strange History of the Ostrich in Fashion, Food, and Fortune, which was published in 1999, I draw upon his childhood memories of frequent family trips to Oudtshoorn, a westerly drive from Port Elizabeth, where he grew up. He writes how these car rides were, quote, a major boyhood adventure for there was, quote, something about the place that was full of giant birds, feathers, and fantasies of Parisian fashion and cabaret, end quote. Here I want to think through his description of an earlier apartheid time and space as washed with the sun and bright blue sky of the Karoo Desert, and involving succulents such as prickly pears and aloes alongside ostriches and Nixon's own fertile imagination. I interpret his text through the lens of the hinterland to first show how white settler colonial towns located directly inward from the South African coastal shoreline like Oudtshoorn, again using a historical concept of the hinterland here, operated historically as pockets of pivot globalizations, as producing, in this case, a thriving industry of ostrich ranching that supplied Europe between the late 1800s and early 1900s with trend-setting fashions. Specifically, Nixon's memoir showcases how far hinterland, and this is a concept from the work of Phil Neal, whose work on hinterlands has been groundbreaking for our own work. So thinking about then his memoir showcasing a far hinterland of Oudtshoorn, farm towns like Oudtshoorn, characteristically rural, and sites of capitalist extraction, to again go back to the concept of the subtitle of our book, become unexpected promised lands, sites that historically absorbed fleeing migrants, in this case Eastern European Jews, who had beached on South Africa's shores, escaping the pogroms of Lithuania. It is yet another form of entanglement for my colleague Sarah Nuttall, wherein a peripheral European trauma feeds into the fashions of its metropolitan centers by way of a refuge offered by South Africa's hinterlands for this Jewish diaspora. It was this group of hopeful immigrants who made small fortunes as ostrich barons, alongside other barons of Afrikaner, English, and Scottish descent, all living in, quote, feather palaces built from the proceeds of the plumes, which, quote, mixed the wildest excesses of Ottoman, Victorian, Greek, and Gothic architecture, end quote. Here, Nixon supplies the astonishing figure that by 1913, 1 million ostriches were being bred for the business, becoming, quote, ounce by ounce more precious than gold, end quote. He recalls how this Jerusalem of Africa became my imaginative oasis, allowing me a whiff of mystery through the coquetry of feathers, end quote. As well, the outrun that Nixon writes about shows the potential of framing historic hinterlands as contemporary failed cities, following Neil again. That is, small towns tied to one particular industry that sometimes aspire for too much and cannot get rid of their rural ties, in this case, Outshorn's association with ostrich farming or ranching, thus losing out in an attempt to become urban centers and quietly receding into oblivion, their rich histories often forgotten. As Nixon recounts, South Africa's hinterland abounded in such towns, end quote. In other words, in Nixon's elegiac writings on this once global epicenter of everything ostrich, those are his words, help revive certain hinterland spaces within South Africa's landscape memory as contemporary hollowed places that are not given, quote, ample space on the side of the road. This is a phrase from Kathleen Stewart, an anthropologist who's worked on the abandoned coal mines of West Virginia. They tend then to get left out of the South African narrative or get reduced to one-stop tourist towns that rely solely on representing their glorified past as heritage. In the sociocultural focus on the strictly urban or strictly rural, that is, which is on the road itself. And so again, thinking about places that have been forgotten and re-evaluating them in the context of today. Next, I rely on Nixon's writings to showcase human, non-human relations as abounding in the hinterland. It is integral to defining and writing about South Africa's landscape as washed with sun. The hinterland is a site where politics and beauty are always messy and where the land, people, and animals, as residents and neighbors, are entwined to the extent that people are anthropomorphized by that which is non-human and vice versa. At one point, Nixon writes, because the crew was so brutally exposed, self-revelation could be costly. Okay, I'm going to go back, yeah. I noticed that not just with the creatures, but with the people, too. They didn't talk much, were slow to open up. To draw attention to yourself was to ask for trouble. Even the plants knew that. Perhaps here we can think of these desert as succulents, including their characteristic hardiness, resilience, and instinct to survive, as equally knowing, agentive and reflective beings as the humans that co-inhabited the harsh landscape. And again, I leave here with a quote, a passage from Nixon that says so much more about South Africa from the perspective of a young boy on the cusp of knowing, who intuits something is wrong with the place he calls home, a place he calls tarnished magic and as yet unspecified ease. So it is significant then to conclude on the section on Rob Nixon that the downward mobility and survival instinct to camouflage and become other on the part of animals, plants, and humans equally, a form of natural selection perhaps, that Nixon was surrounded by and dreamt of the Karoo Desert would become the site of his political consciousness, his way of situating South Africa's stony landscape and politics, and himself as a bird about to migrate in direct contrast to the flightless and cumbersome ostrich, who is stuck, much like apartheid, and as the saying goes, has no choice but to bury its stubborn head in the deep sands of South Africa. Perhaps Dreambirds is a hinterland story foretold of extraction and dreaming both, one that would coalesce itself much later in Nixon's academic writings, including those focused on the slow violence of environmental degradation the world over, which was published in 2011, and perhaps what he is more known for. In a recent reflective turn to the beaches of his South African childhood in 2021, Nixon writes, quote, that title scene and others like it turned me into a reader who parses literature and landscape for who is present, who is missing, for the forced removals, physical and imaginative, from the permitted view. A reader alive to who precisely, in the cropped photo, the selective story, the seemingly seamless landscape has been driven off the beach, end quote. It is in this passage that Nixon presages as his hinterland, Jacob Zalimi, to whom I now turn. Okay. And here I'm going to talk briefly about Jacob Dalimi of Fragments and Flowers, Rats, and Radio Waves. And again, I've put up 2 quotes to give you an impulse, a sense of where he's coming from. Okay. Here I want to contrast Nixon's experience of growing up white in South Africa with that of Dalimi growing up black in South Africa, 1 generation later than Nixon, and on the cusp of its liberation, of its freedom. I will suggest that in his memoir, Native Nostalgia, published in 2009, Dalimi frames township life in Katlehong in important ways that free it from the all-encompassing burden of apartheid, as something else, as having a history, as enabling a life fully lived, as shaping his own reflective grown-up political self. He writes that his book is best understood, quote, as a gathering of fragments of memory, souvenirs of the imagination, end quote, rather than a memoir or cultural biography of Katlehong, even as it contains elements of both. He asserts that though he grew up under apartheid's shadow, life was so much more than that. This is an important point that shows townships as having moments of beauty and political turmoil side by side, again as washed with the sun of everyday life, of children playing together, of a thriving intergenerational community, and of traveling to nearby Germiston, which historically was a pivot point in South Africa's story of globalization, and included a well-established large black urban community dating back to the early 1900s. So just as I reframed the ostrich farm town as a far hinterland following the work of Phil Neal in my previous section, I do the same with the township. Thinking about its location behind and beside city life, a form we could call a near hinterland, part of the, quote, foothills descending from the summit of the megacity and suburban in character and feel, and again from relying on the work of Neal to situate the township. Dalimi's recounting of a childhood spent under apartheid is an experience and recalling that is neither a lament nor a diatribe against the state that placed his family there. Quote, that is to say, one should never take the standard description of townships as poor to mean that township life was poor. His and important interventions that suggest a need to re-examine the place of townships within South Africa's apartheid landscape, not as simply blurred into the urban or forgotten by the wayside or in the between, in the search for black rural authenticity, but rather as a distinct landscape unto itself. Hinterland thinking empowers us to do so and to think expansively. And that's the sort of key analytic of thinking through the hinterland. In other words, Katlehong, meaning place of success in Sesotho, is multiple sites all at once. A black peri-urban center with close ties to nearby historically white and black Germiston, a suburban hinterland, including its associated aspirant qualities and politics resistance, to equally close white Johannesburg, an apartheid geography, in theory, a scientific township where racial capitalism carved spaces to dump black people and restrict access to white spaces. And finally, a microcosm of larger South Africa, past and present. It is all these qualities that help situate the township as a site of extraction and dreaming both, particularly for one of its native sons. In one powerful passage, Dalimi asserts the importance of making the black township the sole subject and object of his memoir. There's no scurrying away from the township's awkward past as an artificial space. Rather, he takes it head-on, forcing the reader contend with his childhood in that place, in that time, which most South Africans would rather forget as still existing given its apartheid birth. Okay. So several sort of aspects here with regard to this, to reading his beautiful book. First, Dalimi gives Katlehong its proper due as a living, breathing black space with its own specific history, one that its residents grew up learning about and taking pride in. It's a place enabled by its multiple connections to elsewhere and shared qualities with other townships of sociability, hybridity, and everyday informality. In other words, the hinterland of his growing up was a very real demarcated area on a map, carved out by apartheid officials on domolitic ground that is part of Johannesburg's East Rand troubled mining topography. Second, Dalimi gives agency to Katlehong's residents, human, plant, and animal equally, in shaping the contours of this hinterland landscape, one that includes vibrant neighborhoods and small acts of care with attention to aesthetic beauty and pride in ownership. Third, Dalimi inserts the important role of the sensory and sonic in our understanding of the township as a hinterland landscape, including the way radio shaped his own political formation. It is less about, quote, relaying the auditory experience of listening to the radio than about highlighting its greater than subaltern role in subverting the government's propaganda, including its ability to awaken, quote, a political consciousness that saw me adopt a politics at odds with the political gradualism and religious conservatism of my mother, end quote. In other words, it directly shaped Dalimi's own black sense of self. And again, so then to think through the importance of the politics of the radio. Okay, and there's a quote there tied to that. Delamy's writings are a political project, one that forces us to look at townships, including their past, present, and future iterations, more closely as near hinterlands, both of the city and not of the city. Quote, rather than wishing that these artificial geographies away, a token of South Africa's disturbing past that is best forgotten. He writes, I quote, I take it as a given that township natives can and do have fond memories of the places in which they were born and grew up, end quote. This early work on township life by Delamy would provide a productive frame for later writings on Kruger's National Park, Safari Nation, which I'm showing here, revealing its hidden history as another hinterland space and formation. And this is a book he wrote in 2020, and I've contrasted it with Rob Nixon's later book on Sylvians, which is 2011. So as another hinterland space and formation in relation to both its animal and human inhabitants who resided, worked, and sometimes crossed through its difficult landscape in an attempt to improve their livelihoods. So again, I hope that this portrait of two hinterland authors give you a sense of how to use hinterland thinking to think about different time-space configurations within the history of the country. Okay, I want to move on to the idea of hinterscapes of self and other. Okay. And again, a quote from Jeremy Foster to provide the context. Okay, both Delamy and Nixon are wrestling with the South African landscapes of their childhood. Both are hinting at hinterlands, using boyhood reflections on growing up as a basis for writing about self and other, about the indelible markers of landscape and identity in the complex entanglement of politics and beauty, extraction and dreaming. Interestingly, each focuses on one beloved object. For Nixon, it is the ostrich, and for Delamy, it's the radio. Each becomes a personalized focal point and medium for political consciousness amidst the hinterland's washed with sun effect. This is a point that very much reverberates with the writings of Foster, interestingly a South African who has also ended up in the U.S., writing from the vantage point on the interiority of self and with the focus on the landscape of his South African childhood. Perhaps that is why I chose his writing as a framing mechanism, for they echo what I am trying to grasp by juxtaposing Nixon and Delamy's powerful and lyrical impressionistic passages on South Africa's complex hinterlands. In other words, I would argue this is exactly what Nixon and Delamy are grappling with through the act of writing: description, memory, childhood consciousness of political wrongdoing, description and interpretation as a form of looking back upon one's life, its moments of introspection, of interiority. The two authors are each other's hinterlands in some sense. The framing of self by each makes clear and without doubt the present absence of the other, not only in terms of South Africa's apartheid political landscape, including racial and generational differences, but also with regard to the specter of racial capitalism and how it functioned differently in the far and near hinterland showcased here. Okay. And here I must insert my own way of seeing South Africa's landscape into a larger understanding, what I'm calling its hinterscapes. As Foster writes, quote, one cannot argue that landscape representation is grounded in the specifics of lived experience and cultural specificity without acknowledging one's own, and I've put that quote here. It is my own childhood of growing up in an American non-place suburban hinterland of Washington, D.C., which could almost be anywhere in the U.S. that Neil interprets so perfectly, and where the connotation of, quote, middle-class white prosperity, end quote, is not a misnomer. It is etched in my mind as a site of my own political formation, a form of wokeness that slowly grew in the face of nondescript land suburban nothingness and being surrounded with not enough difference, whilst very much feeling my own as a daughter of Indian immigrant parents caught up in the American dreamscape. It is my wondrous relationship to South Africa's otherworldly landscape, its attendant beauty and natural light, awash with politics, that have shaped my own writing and grasping of this place I now call home. Here I return to a form of entanglement, as Sarah Nuttall describes it. Entanglement, as I use the term here, is intended to draw into our analyses critical attention to those sites and spaces in which was once thought of as separate, identities, spaces, and histories, come together or find points of intersection in unexpected ways. Hence, my bringing in my own story of hinterland thinking in relation to South Africa and to complexify sort of what I'm trying to argue with the works of Jacob Delamy and Rob Nixon. Okay, and then I want to just conclude by way of conclusion, photographing an upside-down mannequin. Okay, I would like to end my reflections here by turning to a roadside photograph I took in December 2020. It was the first time that my family left Johannesburg for elsewhere during the global pandemic, and we chose driving as a way to get to our destination of Cape Town. It was on our return journey home after stops in Cape Town and locked-down, eerily empty beaches of Plettenberg Bay that we came across this upside-down mannequin plonked down a side road off the main N2 highway, its location very much in South Africa's hinterland heartland. It left an impression on me as capturing my experience and mood, to return to Foster, of the washed with sun South African landscape, including the arid colors of the desert, rust and brown, the deep blue sky, and the bespoke, earthy, cracked dryness which foretells a future of anthropogenic water shortages and periods of drought. It somehow gestured to me as summing up the moment, the feel of pandemic life, as topsy-turvy, as comical relief, even as some might interpret the image as excluding blackness from within hinterland studies or as poking fun at poor rural whites. I read it differently in the midst of a remarkable year filled with tragedy and surrounded by death the world over. It felt like perhaps South Africa's hinterlands could be places of insight, for neglected sites ready for critique and racial comparison, for rethinking self and other, for looking at the deeply historic human, land, plant, and animal and sensorial connections and entanglements, and finally for gathering spots for a range of source materials that include nonfiction writing, photography, and other mediums as forms of the expressive. Such experimental hinterlands, awash with intense sun, light, and color, may offer a way forward to hope for more inclusive futures and a source of humor to think from and with across not only South Africa, but the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gupta, for an illuminating lecture. As part of the program, Professor Gupta and the artists will now engage in conversation about the intersections between the notion of gendered hinterlands and the psychosocial, economic and environmental challenges in an artisanal mining community in Kimberley in the Northern Cape.
Hello, my name is Pamila Gupta, and I'm a research professor based here at the University of Free State. And it's my honor to continue the conversation after my keynote and to think through with two artists who are going to introduce themselves here, Janine Allen and André Rose. And we're going to have a conversation around their wonderful exhibit, Eureka, in relation to my keynote lecture, and thinking through some of the concepts of the hinterland in relation to their artworks. So I'm going to hand it over to you both to introduce yourselves. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Janine Allen. I'm an associate professor at the University of the Free State, and I'm also an artist.
I'm André Rose. I'm a medical doctor, a public health physician by training, and also an artist.
All right, I wanted to start with the first question, tied directly into Jeremy Foster's concept of washed with sun, which is about sort of the entwining of natural beauty with political turmoil. And I thought it's a really wonderful way to think about a phrase that came up during our wonderful walkabout, the aesthetics of the landscape in the hinterland. And perhaps you could say more in relation to some of the artworks here.
Okay. If we look at the work, the painting, which is painted in oil and wax, layering of wax, it's called Hole with Tumbleweed. It shows the aridness of the landscape. The landscape in the hinterland is quite inaccessible in the sense that you can't walk barefoot on it. And then the color palette of the hinterland is very much different than, for example, European landscapes. That's why you always see Monet painting in blues and purples. But the hinterland color palette, consists more of ochres, yellows, oranges, greys, and you can see the layeredness of the land. Specifically in the excavation areas, in the tailing dumps where the artisanal miners mine, and they actually excavate the land, and you can see the layers. It's quite a thorny landscape, quite inaccessible landscape, but also a very beautiful landscape. You have to, if you're not used to that type of aesthetic, you have to grasp it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. And now I want to open it up to both of you for perhaps to speak on this idea of the collaborative aspects of developing the Eureka project in relation to interdisciplinary work, the ideas of gendered ethics, trust, and humanism. So if you could say more on those in terms of the larger project, that would be wonderful.
So I think for me, the project has its origins in that I attended a workshop with Janine, and I didn't know her at the time. And then afterwards I went and introduced myself to her, and we became friends. And because of my interest in art, I was visiting the studio at the university quite a bit. And then I said I wanted to do some transdisciplinary work with her, just because it's we recognize the value of transdisciplinary work and looking at how the disciplines can engage with each other to look at the multifacets of an issue. And I have a particular interest in mining and in occupational health. And then we went through a series of ideas around what we could possibly do, and eventually we did a few scouting trips to Kimberley. Some of the ideas that we have didn't really come to fruition, but my father actually, sort of highlighted this idea. I was like, oh, have you seen what's happening to the Zamas or to the illegal miners?
Yeah.
We don't like that term. But so it's from that, and it's just, for me, it's been a very enriching experience, because it takes the very sort of scientific approach that I have had to research. It's challenged the methodology of how we approach things, challenged the way we understand the data and how it's come in and what the findings have shown, and just literally opened my eyes in a very different way of looking and understanding the issues that were at hand.
Yes. Artisanal miners are quite anonymous because some of them are considered as illegal mine workers. So it was very important in the project from an ethical standpoint to present the miner without exposing in any way specific individuals.
Yes.
So we've used techniques, for example, the Holger camera. There are more double exposures, layering. It was very important for me to, when you spoke in your lecture about the combination of the land and the animal and the human, in this specific work we wanted the mining equipment, the extraction processes, the type of techniques used, and the aridness of the land itself to show humanity, to have an anthropomorphized element in the land, to show human presence, to show human empathy and affect without exposing specific individuals.
That's wonderful. Okay. As a follow-up, which actually speaks to some of the aspects you just mentioned, particularly the kind of cameras you used, can you speak to the mixed, the mediums and the materialities of the actual artworks? To use a phrase that you both used during our walkabout, grit and grain of the project. And thinking about the juxtaposition, I think this is where the power of the works speak, is through juxtaposition of paintings with drawings and sculptural materials alongside photographs, the blurring, both the use of black and white and color film, and the use of the Holga camera, as well as different kinds of lenses. So can you speak to those mediums and the mixing of them as speaking to the power of the images and what you're trying to access?
I think for me, so the Holga camera is a camera, when I started off on the project, I was using a digital camera. And then just through a series of events, came to know about the Holga camera. So just a little about it. It's a toy camera. It's like completely plastic, except for one little part of it, which is the clicking mechanism, which is out of metal. So, and it was developed in the 1980s in China, in Hong Kong, for the working class. And the idea was to mass produce these cameras so that people could have access to it. And but it was cheaply produced. It was imperfect in terms of its technology, very simple. And around about the late 80s, early 90s, it fell into disuse. And the camera was no longer being manufactured, and then a few years later, the factory that was manufacturing it had been rediscovered, and the molds were rediscovered, and they started making some of it again. And it subsequently developed into more of a photography cult following. And so that also just speaks directly to this idea of the camera, which was produced specifically for the working class, to use the camera to photograph the artisanal miners. And the camera produces imperfect imagery, or well, not imperfect, but unpredictable imagery. And I think that that's part of the appeal of it, is that these miners are, you know, they're unpredictable, the industry's unpredictable. It's all analog. It's 120 millimeter format. It has to be hand developed in the same way that the mining process, artisanal mining process, is by hand. And the images often produce a very grainy feel.
This is the
to
grit
it.
and grain that we were talking about.
And so when you look at the images, it's like you see, which is characteristic of a form of analog anyway, is that you see this sandiness about it. And that's what this is also all about, is that we look at the process of the actual mining, the machinery that gets used. And in Janine's installation, you can see, you know, the movement and the rocking of the baby, the so-called sieve that's been used. And so in the same way, there's this, like, we've tried to capture that through the process, through what's been used. In one of the images that I particularly like is an image called Plastic Dreams. And in that image, it's you see the, in quotation marks, the imperfections. You see where there's dust specks on the negative, or where the negative may have been scratched. But you also see the layering of it. You see how the plastic becomes indistinguishable from the reflections of the clouds in the water. And the plastic dreams, the title speaks to this malleability of plastic, but also its uselessness in terms, or its destructiveness within the environment. And, you know, and if you look at some of the other works, there's a series of works where I've inserted another lens into the camera. And at the time, it was to help produce a distortion of the image. But what it created was this iris-like image that allows the viewer to almost be peering down as if through a microscope and to examine and to look at. And there's an image through the grid. And what the image is about how we look through the sieve. You know, and if you look at some of this imagery and metaphor of the sieve, is often in a lot of the images, either subtly there, or in the image, the photograph called rough sieve, which is Afrikaans for a coarse sieve, is that, and the miners will tell you that we have different grades of the sieve, you know, it's like depending on what we're looking for.
André, it reminds me of the work on show that I've made, Corona, which also shows a crown, and that's dealing with the relationship between the history of mining and specific British colonialism in relation to the artisanal miner. And in the crown, I've painted also a grid, but it's more like a technological grid, you know, of pathways, and that shows how, you know, most of the dealing of diamonds are online or the industrial manner, while the artisanal miners still negotiate in the hinterland, in the specific space. But the idea of the grain also reminds me a lot of the philosopher Walter Benjamin, who argues through Bertolt Brecht about we have to make art that is against the grain. So it's to sometimes work with the grain and sometimes against the grain, and specifically if you work with mechanisms of power.
I just, if I can pick up on the, because Corona is really one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition. But like, I think that is like just such a powerful image because it keeps you wanting to come back to look at it, you know, and to explore the nuances within the picture. And because it was, you know, also painted during the time of Corona, it has this like double reference to things, you know, and the work is like very engaging and very, I think, very provocative, you know, because there's these casts of resin which create the image of that the crown jewels, you know, and the diamonds have been pulled out of it, and it suggests the violence of colonialism, the violence of capitalism, that violence of imperialism, and just the like how through that work it speaks to a whole lot of issues around how you were talking about the hinterland and how it like you know, it's there to provide, so it provides the food, it provides the, but it's also through a process of extraction, and that extraction is not a kind process. You know, it's often just, it's met with lots of sort of difficulties and conflicting ideologies and leaving people at the side of the road so that there's nothing for them.
Corona is also painted in wax, which is a very volatile medium, and it's sometimes, what I like about painting with wax is it's a very impermanent medium. It can be solid, but it can melt, and it stands sort of in contrast to the grit, because the grit is rational and organized, while the wax tells of more.
Beautiful. Thank you.
But I think it's also in specific reference to the artisanal miners, like this idea of the grid and being on the grid, is that it speaks to the whole constructs around how mining is regulated as well, and brings in this whole idea of that in South Africa, all mining is illegal if you don't have a license for it. And you can only get that by coming onto this system, onto this grid. And whether you are documented in the country or undocumented, if you're mining without a license, you're an illegal miner.
Yes.
And it's that intricacies that Corona also shows in how the Crown creates pathways, and pathways that often cannot be navigated successfully by people who don't have the, you know, the agency to be able to do that. It's like when you speak to the miners, they'll say to you, it's, you know, of course we can apply for a license, but there are these very rigid structural barriers that hinder us. And, you know, if you're not literate, if you're not computer literate, if you don't have data, if you don't have access to this network, to this grid, it's like you can't
You're off the grid.
negotiate that.
Yeah. Wonderful set of reflections. Thank you. I wanted to go back to the idea of dreaming, because I think it came up right now in our conversation. And if you could perhaps say more about these ideas of storytelling, dreaming, I mean, again, storytelling and listening as research methodologies for this project, because I think that's very much part of what you were trying to do with this, with Eureka.
It's very, very important that we approach the project through storytelling, because it was very, very important for both of us, you know, to be listeners. We had to understand through listening. And the one thing that came up in the storytelling was, like André had said now with the previous question, the idea of the unnetworked peoples not being able to access the network. But on the other hand, in the hinterland, there are wonderful networks of humanity. And that doesn't come through because the technological network sort of
overtakes
it. So many of the stories that we heard and experience in our experiences, you know, for one day, for example, André's car got stuck on a bank in the excavated tailings, and the illegal or the artisanal miners, a group of miners came to us and they helped us in the most wonderful way, and that's not only in that specific incident or experience, but we learned a lot about the untapped intelligence. And we came through the stories that we heard. We came up with the concept of Imagineering. You know, the ability to engineer, but also to imagine, and to think of the imaginary of the hinterland. The one work that I've done, A Sermon in Dust, is specifically many of the artisanal miners come from other towns in the Northern Cape. That's sort of the hinterland of the hinterland of the hinterland, to look for work and then end up being artisanal miners. But they have a wonderful wisdom that they bring, and sometimes they speak to us and tell stories in idioms, and that specific work of a dust storm, the miner looks as if he's a preacher preaching from the sift structure. And I thought about this ability to have the spiritual significance, and this was what is not shown.
And I
Yes,
think,
in the storytelling.
like what that also you know, when we had this incident of getting stuck on the sandbank, and the miners coming to assist us, what, you know, on further reflection, like sometime weeks later on it and stuff, it also just reminded me about the indigenous knowledge systems that are locked up in the hinterland, you know,
Yes.
and you know, that there's this untapped sort of knowledge that and insights that we not that in a way should be mined, you know.
Yes.
And it's
That's
like,
wonderful.
if we think about, you know, very pressing global issues like you know, agricultural techniques or food security or how climate has been affected or how the environment is treated, is it, you know, isn't it lying in there? Isn't it locked up in this knowledge that sits trapped within the hinterland, and that we don't go and explore and, you know, investigate, and, you know.
Okay. Another question is, thinking through the subtitle of the Hinterlands book that's forthcoming, Extraction, Abandonment, and Care, it struck me that there was a wonderful question that came up: who does the soil belong to? It came up during our walkabout, and I wanted to just push you both to say a little bit more on that, and how, you know, again, I think you've already partly answered the question, but to think through the soil itself, the materiality of the soil, and who's the ownership, who it belongs to, thinking through colonialism, capitalism, and climate, and the 3 C's, and then again the 3 L's, livelihood, and thinking through those concepts in relation to the soil.
If I can start, you know, with the history of the mining and the big hole in Kimberley. The idea is that many people from Kimberley think that, or the perception is that the mining companies left them with holes and dilapidated old buildings. So if we take the idea or the metaphor of the hole back to the big hole, and we look at the maps, we can see how the original claims were taken over by mining companies or groups of miners, and then mining companies, and you can see the state capture element there, that it's not a new thing. It can be traced even earlier than the diamond rush, but I think from there on, that question of who does the soil belong to comes from there. And maybe, André, you can discuss, you know, the government's perspective on mining rights and so on.
So, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question and very loaded question with really a lot of facets to it, and, you know, I don't propose to completely understand it, and so this is just my view on this. But, you know, in the catalogue, there's a quote which says that, you know, the poor shall inherit the earth, but not its mineral rights. And I think that that's so poignant.
That's very fitting.
You know, that it's we prepare to give the uselessness of the soil. We're prepared to give soil which cannot produce, which cannot enrich. And we see that typified during apartheid, when the homelands were constructed. When we look at the quality of the land that was given, it was land which didn't have minerals, which couldn't support husbandry, it couldn't support agricultural growth. And so there's that element of like, what are you prepared to give? But then, you know, governments, and not necessarily specifically just the South African government, but, you know, with specific reference to mining rights in this country, is that the law states that all mineral rights belong to the government. And even the large-scale mining companies have to apply for mining rights to extract the minerals. But even then, that wealth doesn't get plowed back into the communities that it comes from. And it's the reference that Janine was referring to earlier. If you speak to, you know, sort of the older generation of Kimberlites and people like my parents' generation, there's they will tell you about how De Beers as a company is held in great revere, but in the same breath, they will tell you about how the wealth was extracted and taken away and used to build a city like Johannesburg, or to enrich the coffers of, you know, the imperialists, and, you know, how that wealth can be traced back to the, you know, sort of British and European empires, you know. And, you know, I often think, I walk around in Europe and I look at the amazing buildings and I think this is built on the sweat and blood of Africans or from the colonies. And so who does that soil belong to? You know, it belongs to the people who live there, you know. And I really don't want to get into the debate of where and who in South Africa is entitled to that, because, you know, the First Nations of this country will be standing, you know, at the front door saying, well, it's ours. But surely that land belongs to people so that they can make a living from it. And at the moment, that is what we're not doing. It's like we haven't allowed people to be able to extract from the hinterland, to be able to farm it, to be able to mine it, to be able to take it and to use it for themselves. And reflecting a little bit back on the previous question, is that, you know, when Janine and I have had like so many interesting conversations with people who would sit with you and tell you that like all we're trying to do is to make a living for ourselves. Like all we're trying to do is to send money home, is to ensure that our children can go to school. You know, we want a better life for ourselves and for our families. And by having these regimented rules and regulations, is that we rob people of that. So I'm in no way, you know, a proponent of anarchy in any way, and there needs to be a control, but who benefits from that, and how do we allow them to have access to it? Because at the moment, the Department of Minerals and Energy Resources is not a custodian of the wealth of the people. That they're controlling the mineral rights, but they're certainly not making it easy for people to be able to live off the land. And so, you know, if I'm pushed to say who does the land, who does the soil belong to, then it belongs to the people who live there. And those people need to be given the right to be able to derive a livelihood from it.
And if I think of the idea of how the media portray the Zama Zama, the idea is a miner that's illegal, that doesn't belong to the soil, that don't have access, that perception is totally in contrast with the stories that we've heard.
And I mean, just to pick up on the issue of media, there's a lot of we are very aware of the criminality that's associated with the industry as well. We're familiar with the destruction of the environment, but in the same breath is that it's those elements have crept in because the political and legal structures have made it virtually impossible for people to be able to really negotiate and engage with the land, and you know,
and to embody the land.
And so there's just no like fairness around that. So if we're talking about it from a almost philosophical, ethical point of view, you know, there's no justice in it. There's no you know, benevolence in it. It's like it becomes a complete debate around it, that it enriches only the coffers of selected people. You know, and even if the big mining companies, if government was using it to, you know, to empower those communities, I don't see it. I mean, I have literally walked the Northern Cape, and I have traveled to its smallest of places, and I don't see the beneficiation that comes, you know. And the beneficiation that happens in terms of corporate social responsibility is like wrapped up in developing, you know, almost, I think, like menial activities like developing early childhood development centers, or giving the communities a park, but it doesn't really come and change it. It doesn't take those communities, empower them, and allow them to become, you know, to see their potential come to fruition. So, you know, who does the soil belong to? If the soil is there to be a conduit for people to live well and to thrive, then there's no equity at the moment in terms of how, you know, we are managing the land, we're managing the soil.
Thank you. One last question just to throw out to you both is, where are the women in this picture? Just to think about the context here of the Gendered Worlds Lecture. Are they missing? Are they absent? Are they very much there?
They are there. It's the one specific photograph that I've taken, Collectivity and Loneliness, shows a woman, which is a very important person in the structure of and organization of the artisanal miners, specifically in one area in Kimberley called the Beefmaster area. Artisanal mining is quite a complex, there's a complex layeredness about it, because there are many people that also mine in their free time over weekends. And we've met female miners that mine over weekends and have other work. In the beginning, it was more observant that more men are mining, because it's extremely labor-intensive work and it takes about 6 months sometimes to find a diamond. But all the more women do mine. Maybe you can speak about the issue.
So you know, this exhibition has travelled, and it's been, you know, it had its premiere in Kimberley at the William Humphreys Art Gallery, and it's one of the issues that came up. Someone also challenged us and said, where are the women? And so we have some, you know, the body of work that you see is but the tip of the iceberg of what's there. And there are some images of women that have been deliberately been left out. And part of that is there's a symbolicness, metaphoricness about leaving women out of this exhibition, because it speaks to how women have been left out of, you know, of this, in the circular economy, is that we struggle with mining, women in mining in South Africa. They're not well represented. If they are counted, they're counted in the big companies as the working in HR or administrative jobs. They're not making the hardcore decisions around the engineering of the mine or around the financial decisions about it. And so, so there's a gap that has to be filled there. But even so, and we see that reflected when we walk these fields within, you know, in Kimberley, etc., is that, and the women have this almost triple burden when you look at them in this area, because some of them have come to mind physically, and that's one job they're doing. The other job is that they're looking after children,
Yes.
and they're looking after the household.
And that's why they're also more protective of their identity. So that was a very important aspect, that the woman is more protective, specifically in the times when there has been a lot of artisanal miners also mined illegally, not only on the tailing dumps, but actually within the territory of the mines. That you break the fence and work, and they're quite sensitive about not being exposed.
But I think if I can maybe just push this a little bit, is also the when we've spoken to not just the female miners, but also the other miners, it's like what pervades, and it reflects back on your question about dreaming. And I'd like to just explore that a little bit more.
Certainly.
Is that like the issue of dreaming is, I think if you look at the exhibition, it just comes through like so strongly all the time, even if it's not in a work that specifically deals with dreaming. But there's a series of photographs called The Dreamers, which looks at which has this almost painterly quality about it, and this ghost-likeness of the figures within the landscape. But there's a photograph called On the Carpet of Dreams, and there's Janine's drawing underneath
the carpet of riches.
Right.
And all of those works just like either directly or indirectly allude to like why these people are there. It's like some of them are there because they're just trying to make a living, and they're dreaming of a better life. They're dreaming of food on the table. They're dreaming, if we look at it at Maslow's hierarchy. Some of them are just trying to meet those very basic needs. But then you get the guys. It's like, remember the guy who has a salon, It's like we met this guy at the mining site once who he's one of those weekend miners.
And we've also met, for example, a female teacher that mines on over weekends.
And but like the guy with the salon, he was like, I'm not interested in the little stones. It's like, I want the big ones, It's like the sift that I use.
Eureka moment, to refer back to your title.
Exactly, and it's, that's like even what the title just, strongly tries to remind the viewer of, is that people are looking for this Eureka moment. They're looking for this moment in which they will discover that which will rip them out of poverty.
Which is the dream itself.
Which is
well,
the dream.
the
which
elusive
will
dream.
escalate them to something bigger, And it's...
And the beer slogan is "A diamond is forever," but that's sort of a construct about what attracts people to diamonds, the glisten, the quality of eternal wealth. But it's not forever, not for the hinterland.
And it's this in Janine's installation. There's these scales, and it's this constant balancing between, this ideology of enriching, of colonizing, of imposing upon, versus the people who come from that hinterland who are saying it's like all we want is a chance, and so there's this balance between wealth, between those who are enriching for the sake of enriching, and those who are enriching so that they can become all that they were meant to be. And I think, for me anyway, and I think, from the many myriads of conversations Janine and I have had, like that's what remains with us. It's like these are people who have got such passion for life, who want to see themselves in a different light, who want to see that dream come to fruition. And it's like, there's just all these barriers to it.
Well, I see both your passion very much so in the art and talking about it. So thank you today for taking the time to talk to me and connecting the idea of the diamonds are not forever in the hinterland. I think that's a nice ending note. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
To continuing the conversations in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I would now like to deliver the vote of thanks. First, I would like to thank our speaker, Prof Pamila Gupta, for an insightful and provocative lecture. To the artists of the Eureka exhibition, Professor Janine Allen and Dr. André Rose, thank you for being willing to participate in this way and contributing to such a vibrant discussion and reflections. Then, to our partners in this event, Angela de Jesus and staff from the UFS Gallery, you have our deepest thanks for partnering in this event. It is not the first time that we have collaborated in this way. We deeply value our collaborations throughout the years, and we hope for many more. As always, my deepest gratitude to staff in the Centre who work so hard in the organization of such events, in particular Portia Galele. Thank you for all the diligent work to make these events a reality. I hope you've enjoyed the Biennial Gendered Worlds Lecture brought to you by the Centre for Gender and Africa Studies and the UFS Art Gallery. From me, Dr. Stephanie Kaywood, thanks for watching and goodbye.